Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you something that's going to stir your spirit today. It's going to shake up the very core of who you are. I need you to stay with me, because if you get this, it'll change your perspective forever. You see, we've all been there. That moment when the storm hits, when the waves crash against your soul, when life does not make sense, when the path you're walking feels uncertain and the road ahead is full of questions. And in that moment, you find yourself asking, why God? Why me? Why this? You don't have to say it out loud. I know you've said it in your spirit. Why did this happen? Why am I struggling? Why is the door closed? Why has the answer not come? Listen to me. I want to talk to you about trusting when you don't understand. When the pieces of your life don't seem to fit together, when the situation doesn't make sense, and the logic of this world tells you that you should give up. There's something you've got to know. The absence of understanding does not mean the absence of purpose. Just because you can't see it with your natural eyes doesn't mean that God is not working it out in the spirit. God is working in the unseen, behind the scenes, in ways you cannot comprehend. Let me tell you, sometimes God's greatest blessings come wrapped in confusion. Sometimes God's deliverance doesn't come in the way you thought it would. Times He will allow you to walk through the fire, not because He doesn't love you, but because He's refining you. He's shaping you. He's molding you into the person He's called you to be. And in those moments, you won't always understand why things are happening the way they are. But you've got to trust the process. When you look at your life and it doesn't make sense, that's the moment to stretch your faith. That's the moment to lean not on your own understanding. You see, we get too caught up trying to figure everything out. We think we need all the answers, but the truth is we don't. It's not about understanding the how or the why. It's about trusting the who. It's about knowing that the one who's holding you, the one who's walking with you, the one who's got you in the palm of His hand, He's got it all under control. I know it's hard to trust when you're in the middle of a storm, when you're looking around and nothing makes sense. I know it's difficult when the people you thought would be there aren't there. When the job you thought was secure is no longer there. When your health is failing and your future looks uncertain. But you've got to trust in God's timing. You've got to trust that what He's doing in your life is for a purpose, even when you can't see it. You may not understand the storm, but God's got a purpose for the rain. You may not understand the delay, but God's got a purpose for the waiting. You see, there are seasons in life when we have to trust, even when we don't understand. It's in those seasons that our faith is stretched. It's in those moments that we discover what we're really made of. You see, when everything is going well and everything is falling into place, it's easy to trust. It's easy to praise God when everything is perfect, when the bills are paid, the job is secure, the family is healthy. But what happens when the storm hits? What happens when life starts to unravel? What happens when your plans fall apart? Can you still trust then? Can you still hold on to the promises of God when everything around you is falling apart? Let me remind you, God is not limited by what you understand. He's not confined to your logic. His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. That means He's got a bigger picture in mind. You're looking at one piece of the puzzle, but God's got the entire picture. Your current situation is just one moment in your journey. Don't judge your future based on your present. Don't make permanent decisions based on temporary circumstances. So trust that God is at work behind the scenes even when you don't see it. There's a story in the Bible about a man named Joseph. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. He was sold into slavery. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison. And for years, Joseph's life seemed to be nothing but one setback after another. He didn't understand why all these things were happening to him. He didn't understand why his dreams were shattered. And he didn't understand why the people he loved turned their backs on him. But here's what Joseph did. He kept trusting. He kept believing. He kept holding on to the promise that God, even when life doesn't make sense, trust that God is working behind the scenes and refining you for a greater purpose. The absence of understanding doesn't mean the absence of purpose. In moments of confusion and uncertainty, it's crucial to trust in God's timing and plan, even when you don't understand the why or how. Faith is about trusting the who, the one who holds your future, Life's challenges often don't align with our understanding, but God's ways and thoughts are higher than ours. He's working on a bigger plan, and we can't always see it from our limited perspective. Like Joseph in the Bible, who faced betrayal, hardship, and imprisonment, we too must keep trusting and believing, even when everything seems to be falling apart. God's purpose is still unfolding, even in the midst of struggle. Trust in God's process is one of the most powerful and essential principles we can embrace in our walk of faith. It's easy to talk about trust when everything is going well, when the sun is shining and the path is smooth, but trust becomes something more significant and challenging when the road gets rocky, when the clouds cover the sky, and when the storm begins to rage. It's in these moments of uncertainty, confusion, and pain that trusting in God's process becomes not just an option, but a necessity for survival and victory. The truth is, we often want answers. We want to understand why things happen the way they do, why we go through the pain we endure, why the dreams we have seem delayed, or why the doors we expect to open stay shut. We want clarity in the midst of our struggles. We want to know that everything is going to work out, and we want to know when. But here's the hard truth. God does not owe us explanations. He doesn't always reveal his plan in advance. His process, his ways, and his timing are beyond what we can comprehend with our finite understanding. God's process is not based on our schedules. It's not based on our human expectations. It's based on divine wisdom, a wisdom that is perfect and complete. We don't see the full picture, but God sees everything. And his process, even when it doesn't make sense, is always moving us closer to the destiny he has planned for us. The journey may not always look like what we expect, but the destination is always aligned with his will, which is always good. When you think about trusting in God's process, think about the way a potter works with clay. The potter doesn't just throw a lump of clay on the wheel and let it spin aimlessly. No, the potter applies pressure, makes adjustments, and shapes it into something beautiful and purposeful. The process can be uncomfortable. There's pressure, there's molding, there's stretching. There are times when the clay is pushed in a direction it didn't expect. But in the end, what the potter creates is something beautiful. You may not understand why God is allowing the pressure in your life, why he's pushing you in certain directions, but trust that he's making something beautiful out of your life. The potter knows what the clay is supposed to become, and that's why he carefully shapes and molds it. Trusting in God's process means we have to embrace the idea that God knows what he's doing. Even when we feel lost, even when we feel alone, even when we question why we're going through what we're going through, God is at work. He's working all things together for good, even when it doesn't look good, feel good, or seem good. He sees the bigger picture, and we have to trust that he's guiding us towards something greater than we can imagine. There's something powerful that happens when you surrender to God's process. And when you choose to trust, even in the dark and uncertain moments, you begin to align yourself with his purpose. You stop trying to control the outcome, and you start letting God lead you. The more you trust him, the more peace you experience, because you know that he's in control. You can't see the entire plan, but you can trust that God's plan is always good, and he will never leave you or forsake you. In the Bible, we see so many examples of people who trusted God's process. Think about the Israelites when they were in bondage in Egypt. They were crying out for deliverance. They wanted to be free from the oppression they were facing. And God heard their cries. But here's the thing. God didn't deliver them immediately. In fact, he allowed them to endure hardship for years. There were times when they questioned whether God had forgotten them, whether his promises would ever come to pass. But God was working behind the scenes. He was preparing them for the promised land, a land that he had already set aside for them. The process was painful, but it was necessary for them to grow and learn to trust him. And when the time was right, God brought them out of Egypt, not just as individuals, but as a nation. His process was never about their immediate comfort. It was about their long-term purpose. Similarly, Joseph's story is a perfect example of trusting God's process. Joseph, the young man with dreams of greatness, found himself sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was thrown into prison on false charges. He was abandoned, forgotten, and left to suffer for years. Joseph could have questioned everything, his dreams, his faith, and even the very existence of God. But Joseph held on to something deeper than his circumstances. He trusted the process. He didn't understand why it was happening, but he trusted that God had a plan for his life. And when God's timing was right, Joseph was elevated to a position of power in Egypt, a position from which he could save his family and the entire nation. Joseph didn't understand the process while he was going through it. He didn't understand why he had to face betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. But he trusted that God was sovereign and that in the end, God's purpose would prevail. And that trust in the process, even when everything around him seemed hopeless, is what ultimately brought him to the place of blessing. Now, I'm not saying that trusting God's process means everything will be easy. It doesn't mean that your life will be free from pain, hardship, or disappointment. But it does mean that you can face those challenges with the confidence that God is with you. It means that even in the midst of the storm, you can hold on to the truth that God is working it out for your good. You may not understand it. Faith beyond understanding is a profound concept that challenges the very essence of how we approach our relationship with God. It asks us to step beyond the limits of human logic, beyond the reach of our own understanding, and into a realm where trust and belief transcend what we can see, hear, or comprehend. It is one of the most powerful aspects of the Christian journey, one that requires us to surrender our need for answers and embrace a deeper, more trusting walk with God, especially in times of uncertainty, hardship, and pain. It's easy to have faith when things are clear, when the path ahead is visible, and when everything seems to be aligning perfectly with our desires. But what happens when the road is obscured, when the lights go out, and the future seems unclear? What happens when the promises God has spoken over your life seem to be in contradiction to your present circumstances? Can you still have faith when you can't see the next step, when you don't know where you're going or how you're going to get there? That's when faith beyond understanding comes into play. At its core, faith beyond understanding is about trusting God even when the logic of the world doesn't make sense. It's about surrendering to His will even when you can't see the entire picture. It's about knowing that God's ways are higher than our ways, His thoughts higher than our thoughts, and His plans infinitely more perfect than our own. The human mind craves understanding. We want explanations. We want to know why things happen the way they do, why doors open and close, why some prayers seem to be answered and others seem to be delayed. But faith, true faith, is about stepping beyond that need for intellectual clarity and embracing the truth that God is sovereign and that He is working on our behalf even when we can't see the details. Think about the story of Abraham, the father of faith. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but here's the catch. Abraham was old and his wife Sarah was barren. God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, but that promise seemed impossible in light of their circumstances. Abraham and Sarah had every reason to doubt, every reason to question how God could fulfill such a promise. Yet despite the impossibility of the situation, Abraham chose to believe. He didn't fully understand how God was going to do it, but he trusted that God could and would keep His word. And it was that faith beyond understanding that led to the birth of Isaac, the fulfillment of God's promise and the beginning of the nation of Israel. There are times in life when we, like Abraham, are asked to step into the unknown. We are called to believe in something that seems impossible, something that contradicts the circumstances we're facing. And yet, faith beyond understanding is precisely what we need in those moments. When the storm is raging and the winds are howling, when the answer is not coming and the pressure is mounting, that is when we need to trust that God is still in control. Even when we can't see the outcome, we can trust that He has already seen it and is working all things together for our good. The Bible tells us that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Hebrews 11:01. This verse is a clear reminder that faith often requires us to believe in what we cannot see, touch, or fully comprehend. When we have faith beyond understanding, we are choosing to believe in the promises of God, even when our current circumstances don't align with them. It's choosing to trust that the God who has always been faithful will continue to be faithful even when we cannot see the way forward. There's another story in the Bible that speaks to this kind of faith, the story of Job. Job, a man of great faith and integrity, faced unimaginable loss. He lost his wealth, his health, and his family. In the midst of his suffering, Job had every reason to curse God and question his goodness. His friends, who were supposed to be his support system, accused him of wrongdoing, and the pain he endured seemed to have no end in sight. Yet despite all of this, Job refused to turn away from God. He didn't understand why he was suffering. He didn't understand what God was doing or why God had allowed such pain in his life. But Job declared, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." Job 13:15. Job's faith was not dependent on understanding why things were happening, but on the unshakable belief that God was still in control. Job's faith went beyond his understanding of his circumstances, and in the end, God restored him even more abundantly than before. Faith beyond understanding requires us to be willing to trust God even when we don't have the answers. It requires humility to acknowledge that as finite human beings, we cannot fully comprehend the infinite mind of God. It requires us to let go of the need to control every aspect of our lives and to trust that God's plans for us are good, even when we cannot see how they will unfold. One of the most difficult aspects of faith beyond understanding is the patience it demands. In a world that is driven by instant gratification, where answers are expected to be immediate, waiting can feel like a burden. We live in an age where information is available at our fingertips, and we have come to expect that we can know everything at once. But God's process doesn't always operate on our timetable. There will be seasons when we don't have the answers, when the breakthrough is delayed, and when the waiting seems unbearable. But faith teaches us to trust God's timing, even when it doesn't align with our own. In Isaiah 55:8-9, God reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This passage highlights the truth that God's understanding is far beyond our own. There will be moments in life when we can't understand what God is doing, why he is doing it, or why he is taking so long to bring us the answer. But when we step into faith beyond understanding, we trust that God's ways are always higher and better than our own. Faith beyond understanding doesn't mean we ignore our doubts or pretend that we don't have questions. It doesn't mean that we suppress our emotions or act as if everything is fine when it isn't. It means that despite our doubts, we choose to trust in the goodness and faithfulness of God. It means that even when we don't have the answers, we trust that God has them. It means that when we can't see the way, we trust that he can. Faith beyond understanding is not passive. It's not about simply waiting for something to happen while we sit idly by. It's about actively trusting, actively believing, and actively surrendering our will to God's. It's about aligning our hearts with his heart and letting him guide us even when the way forward is unclear. It's about walking in obedience even when we don't fully understand the path ahead. There are seasons in life when God calls us to step out in faith, to take that leap, to walk in obedience, even when we don't know what's on the other side. God's bigger picture is one of the most powerful and awe-inspiring truths we can embrace in our faith journey. It speaks to the reality that God is working in ways beyond what we can see, beyond what we can comprehend, and beyond what we often understand in our finite minds. The concept of God's bigger picture calls us to recognize that our lives are not isolated events, but part of a larger divine tapestry, being woven with intention, purpose, and love. Even when we can't see the entire design, even when we're in the middle of the chaos or the unknown, God is still at work, painting a masterpiece out of our lives and circumstances. The human experience is often marked by moments of confusion, pain, and uncertainty. We face setbacks, challenges, and delays, and it's easy to become discouraged when the road ahead seems unclear or when our prayers seem unanswered. It's tempting in those moments to look at our circumstances and think that they are the sum total of our lives, that our present struggles are all there is. But God's bigger picture reminds us that our lives are part of a larger divine narrative that we don't yet fully understand. Our pain, our suffering, our waiting, and our victories are all interwoven into God's perfect plan. One of the most powerful aspects of God's bigger picture is that it's not limited by time or space. We live in a world where we are bound by time. We think in terms of days, weeks, months, and years. We make decisions based on our immediate circumstances, and we are often focused on the here and now. We tend to judge our lives by the immediate events and outcomes we see in front of us. But God is not bound by time. He exists outside of time and sees the beginning, middle, and end of our lives all at once. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. He is the Creator who spoke the universe into existence, and He has already seen the entirety of your story from beginning to end. When we understand that God sees the whole picture, we are able to trust in His sovereignty, even when we can't see what He's doing in our lives. There are moments when we are in the midst of a trial or a season of waiting, and it feels like we're stuck in one chapter of a book, unsure of how the story will unfold. But God is the author of that story, and He knows exactly how it will end. He has a plan for each and every one of us, and He's weaving every detail together to bring about something good, something beautiful, and something beyond our comprehension. There are countless examples in the Bible of people who couldn't see the bigger picture, but were ultimately part of God's grand plan. Take, for example, the story of Joseph. Joseph's life was filled with hardship, betrayal, and unjust treatment. He was sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit, and imprisoned for years. From a human perspective, it seemed like his life was a series of unfortunate events. But Joseph was a key player in God's bigger picture. The suffering he endured was not in vain. It was part of a divine plan that would ultimately save an entire nation. When Joseph finally saw the bigger picture, he recognized that what the enemy meant for evil, God had used for good. Genesis 50:20. Joseph didn't understand God's plan while he was going through the pain. He didn't understand why he was sold into slavery or why he was thrown into prison. But God's bigger picture was at work behind the scenes, positioning Joseph to become a leader in Egypt and eventually save his family from famine. Had Joseph not endured the hardship, the entire nation of Israel might have perished. God's bigger picture is always at work, even when we can't see it, even when we don't understand it. Another example of God's bigger picture can be seen in the life of Moses. Moses was raised as an Egyptian prince. Joseph's story stands as a remarkable model of trust in God's process, one that exemplifies enduring faith despite betrayal, hardship, and immense uncertainty. His life is a testimony to the fact that trust in God is not always about understanding the why or the how of the circumstances, but about believing that God is at work even when all evidence points to the contrary. Joseph's story is a powerful example of how trusting God through trials can lead to triumphs that are far beyond what we could ever imagine. His journey was not easy, and it didn't make sense at the time, but in the end, Joseph could look back and see that everything he went through was a part of a larger divine plan designed by God. Joseph's story begins with a dream. A young man, Joseph, had visions that he would rise to a position of great leadership, that his brothers would one day bow down to him. In a family already marked by dysfunction, Joseph's dreams ignited a spark of jealousy and resentment in his brothers. This jealousy eventually led to betrayal. They conspired to kill him, but instead sold him into slavery. From the moment Joseph was taken from his father's house, his life took an unexpected turn. Imagine the confusion and pain Joseph must have felt in that moment. Betrayed by his own flesh and blood, sold as a slave to a foreign land, Joseph could not have understood what was happening to him. He had no idea why this was happening, no understanding of how his dreams could ever come true when everything seemed to be falling apart. But one of the most striking aspects of Joseph's story is that despite all of the pain and confusion, Joseph never lost his trust in God. And his journey took him to Egypt, where he served as a slave in the house of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. But even as a slave, Joseph did not allow bitterness or despair to consume him. Instead, he worked diligently, trusting that God was with him. The Bible tells us that the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. Genesis 39:2. Joseph's trust in God even in the most difficult of circumstances, allowed him to rise above his situation. This is the story of Joseph. Potiphar saw his integrity, his hard work, and his trustworthiness and placed him in charge of his entire household. Joseph's trust in God wasn't based on the outward circumstances. He wasn't prospering because his life was easy. He was prospering because he chose to trust God in the middle of adversity. Joseph's example teaches us that even when we are in situations that seem to have no hope, we can still trust that God is working. He may not always remove us from the circumstances, but he is always with us in them. And he can still bless us, guide us, and elevate us, even in the most unlikely places. But Joseph's trust was tested even further. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, and when Joseph refused, she falsely accused him of attempting to assault her. As a result, Joseph was thrown into prison. Once again, Joseph found himself in a place of immense suffering because he had failed Joseph, who found himself in the way he found him. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was punished. If anyone had reason to question God's plan, it was Joseph. His life seemed to be full of setbacks, one after another. First, he was betrayed by his brothers, then sold into slavery, and now he was in prison for something he didn't do. But Joseph's trust never wavered. He didn't allow bitterness or anger to take root in his heart. Instead, the Bible tells us that the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Genesis 39, verse 21. Even in prison, Joseph's trust in God was evident. He didn't allow his circumstances to define him. His trust in God gave him the strength to maintain his integrity and character no matter where he was. God's presence and favor were upon Joseph, and once again he rose to a position of leadership, this time in the prison. The warden saw Joseph's trustworthiness and made him responsible for all the other prisoners. Joseph's story teaches us an important lesson. Trusting God isn't just about the good times when everything is going well. It's about trusting him when life doesn't make sense. Joseph could have easily turned his back on God in the face of such adversity. He could have allowed bitterness and resentment to cloud his heart. He could have questioned why God would allow him to suffer in such a way, but instead Joseph chose to trust God's process, believing that God had a bigger plan, even if he couldn't see it in the moment. Joseph's trust was ultimately rewarded when he interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker while they were in prison. Joseph correctly interpreted their dreams, and when the cupbearer was released, he promised to mention Joseph's name to Pharaoh. But the cupbearer forgot about Joseph, leaving him in prison for another 2 years. Once again, Joseph's trust in God was tested. He had done the right thing, helped others, and yet he was left forgotten and alone. It would have been so easy for Joseph to lose heart, to give up on his dreams, to stop trusting in God. But Joseph's trust remained steadfast. Finally, the moment came when Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret. The cupbearer remembered Joseph, and Joseph was brought before Pharaoh. God gave him the wisdom to interpret Pharaoh's dream, foretelling 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh recognized Joseph's wisdom and elevated him to the second highest position in all of Egypt, putting him in charge of preparing for the coming famine. Joseph's rise to power was the culmination of years of hardship, testing, and trust. In this book, we read about that. When his brothers came to Egypt during the famine seeking food, Joseph had the opportunity to seek revenge. But Joseph didn't do that. He recognized that the pain he had endured, the betrayal, and the suffering were all part of God's bigger picture. He said to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:20. Joseph's story shows us the power of trust in God's process. He couldn't have understood the reason for his suffering at the time, but looking back, he could see that everything had been part of God's divine plan. God used the betrayal of his brothers, his time in slavery, and his time in prison to position him for a place of influence and leadership. And through it all, Joseph maintained his faith, trust, and integrity. Joseph's trust in God's process teaches us that even when we face hardships, even when life doesn't make sense, God is still at work. His plans for us are always good, and he can use every circumstance, every trial, every moment of pain for his purpose. Joseph's trust in God was not based on his understanding, but on his confidence that God was with him, guiding him, and using every experience for his glory and for Joseph's ultimate good. Trusting in God's process isn't always easy. There will be times when we face setbacks, disappointment, and confusion, but Joseph's story reminds us that when we trust God, he can use our struggles to bring about something greater. We may not always understand the why or the how of our circumstances, but we can trust that God has a bigger picture in mind. Just as Joseph's pain was part of a divine plan to save many lives, our struggles, when we trust God, can lead to a greater purpose that we may not fully understand now, but that will become clear in God's perfect timing. Joseph's life is a beautiful example of unwavering faith, trust in God's process, and a reminder that God's plan is always greater than our own.